So yeah, we're so thrilled to have Katie join us today. She's an associate professor from the Department of French and Italian at Princeton. And she's a specialist in both, among many things, Renaissance France, Michel de Montaigne, and contemporary French thought, including in particular deconstruction and Jacques Derrida. So she's also the director of the Bibliothèque Derrida at Éditions du Seuil, and at Princeton, she's the director of Derrida's Margins Digital Humanities Project. Her new book project is looking at what she calls strange flowers, radical quotation from Montaigne to Derrida. But today she's here, as you know, to present and to discuss her first book, which came out in 2019 with the University of Pennsylvania Press, The Prosthetic Tongue, Printing Technology, and the Rise of the French Language. So we're so pleased to have you, Katie, and we can't wait to hear about the book and to ask you all about it. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for the invitation. It is really a super big treat for me, as I was saying just a minute ago to Jenny and Marie, to be here, among other reasons, because even though I've not yet had the experience of speaking with you, from what I know of the group and what I've heard about the group from Jenny and the very name writing technologies, seems to suggest to me that the kind of discussion that you've been doing, the kind of thinking you've been doing together, is kind of tuned in to something similar to what I was trying to tune into in rethinking the history of the French language in a certain way, not just, you know, sort of in relation to the history of the book and printing, which had been done before, right? And there's actually a really established history of thinking about, you know, how the so-called rise of the French language coincides with, happens somehow in some conjunction with the rise of printing, again, so-called rise of printing, with that, you know, development, first introduction and development of a new writing technology. But it seemed to me that that relationship was really under-theorized and under-thought, and that something was happening between the French language and printing. And then beyond printing, the question of technology in a broader sense, right? And that's in the 16th century, sort of over the course of the 16th century, and especially starting with a moment that I'll be talking about in more detail here, starting really in the late 1520s, and even more precisely, I would say in 1529, with the publication of Geoffroy Théorie Champfleury, there is a thinking of the French language as itself a technology, as technologizable, right? That's not a word I've ever used before, as you see from the fact I can't pronounce it, right? But there's a thinking of first a historicity and then a technicity of vernacular language that is, I think, a historically distinct moment, right? So even if, and this is a point that's very important to me, even if there is already or always already a technicity to language, right? Even if language was never not technological, that doesn't mean that language is always technological in the same way or to the same degree or with the same effects, right? So we could, you know, we kind of broadly agree that the invention of writing would somehow affect the technicity of language, or the way in which language operates as techne, right? If we have, you know, however many centuries or millennia of human history, right, and these things are still kind of interestingly vague for the most part, even though there's some rather good archaeological work, right? So even if spoken language is already technological, the invention and development of writing and writing practices has to have done something pretty fundamental to language, right? And we see that with, you know, the developments of grammars in antiquity, for example, grammars and rhetorics and all kinds of techne of writings, right? And that word techne, as I'm sure you all know, but I'll just say it so that it's out on the table, you know, in that Greek sense, means both, right, the kind of art or skill or practice, but also the written treatise itself, right? A grammatical techne, what then becomes the art, right? So when we're talking about, you know, la rhétorique, right, in the 16th century, or you know, l'art de la grammaire, or l'art poétique, famously, right? Already in Latin, and then already in Greek before that, that art or techne was the way that you referred to the text itself, because it was that text that enabled the technicization or technologization of those practices of language, right? It was the written text itself that turned practices of language into, you know, repeatable, mechanical, or you know, kind of proto-mechanical practices that could be reiterated, right? So it introduced a new means or technology of iterability, right? Repeatability. Anyway, so this is just a kind of long lead up to say, whatever happens in the 16th century is not technology colliding into some previously or otherwise natural vernacular language, right? There's already technology at work wherever there's language, even before writing, right? This is now the Derridian in me coming out. This is that generalized sense that Derrida gives to the term writing that you're hearing coming out, right? But so there's already something, as soon as there's a sign, as soon as language is iterable in the first instance, repeatable, recognizable as a sign, there's something like techne already happening there. So techne doesn't crash into language, you know, in the 1450s with the Western, you know, invention or development of, you know, movable type technology. But something does happen, right? And that's the big question to me. Something nevertheless happens, even if writing already had in it something technological, even if language already had in it something technological, something seemingly massive happens in what, for example, the historian and linguist Sylvain Auroux has called, you know, the second movement or moment of technologization, right? That we have a kind of historical, seemingly epochal shift that happens starting in the late 15th and then especially with much greater intensity in the 16th century, right? And printing would not be alone in terms of, you know, factors in that happening, right? It seems that, you know, humanist language practices, philological practices, other older technologies, right? Ancient technologies, Greek and Latin techne of language are being revived and then somehow put to different other more intense uses when they sort of come to form this, what, you know, we could think of as like a kind of technological assemblage of printing. And something that I mention in the book a little bit in passing, but that was enormous for me as I was thinking about this question, something that like haunted me, and that when I would start to think is, you know, am I doing something that's far-fetched? This relationship between, you know, the way that printing seems to mobilize the technicity of language in some kind of unprecedented way. I would think about this fact, which is, you know, Gutenberg didn't print the Bible to start, right? You don't start with something as expensive and difficult and monumental as the Bible, especially, you know, if you, I'm sure you all are familiar with Gutenberg Bibles or have, you know, seen one or two in your time, right? I mean, that's a massive undertaking. You're going to do tests and experiments. You're going to print other things first. And what does Gutenberg print? He prints Donatus's grammar, the little one, right? The Ars Minor. That's what Gutenberg prints. And, you know, there are lots of reasons for Gutenberg to print that text first, right? For that to be the first text produced with movable type technology. It's an extremely popular book, right? It's one of, if not the kind of fundamental school book of the 15th century. It's the beginning of, a humanist or even just kind of general Latin education program. There's a big market for that book. But also, what does the Ars Minor, or almost any classical grammar, begin by doing? It begins by breaking language down into its constituent parts, right? And it begins by saying, there are parts to language. Here are how many parts there are. Here are what those parts are, right? And most classical grammars also begin by saying, here are the letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, right? Which is precisely, as we know, what movable type technology does in a way that was, of course, already happening with alphabetic writing to begin with, or it couldn't have already been there in those classical grammars. But movable type technology seems to take that part that is the letter and put it to some kind of tremendous use that the way that I tend to think about this is, it really sort of unleashes some force, right? That mobility, that movability of type seems to unleash some kind of tremendous force that is already at work, and yet then gets, goes from being virtual to actual, right, in some way that has tremendous cultural, political, historical consequences. And so that's what I'm really trying to track in the book. What are the consequences? And what are the consequences in particular when that technology comes into contact not only with Latin, which is where it primarily is operating at first. Latin, the language that Dante famously characterizes, in keeping with, a long tradition at that point, a long medieval tradition, a thinking of Latin as artificial, right? Because Latin is the language that has grammar, Latin and Greek, and then Hebrew, right, which has this kind of same but other status as Latin and Greek. Right, these languages that have been immobilized, as it were, by technology, by grammar, right? They stopped moving in time. They've stopped changing their form to some extent, right? They've been given some other state of existence that is called by Dante, for example, artificial, right? Those languages exist in contradistinction to natural languages, right? The so-called vernaculars or mother tongues. And it's interesting to note that that term mother tongue, before this moment that I'm interested in the middle of the 16th century, that term does not mean the same thing that it means sort of in the modern sense that it comes to have precisely in the 16th century, because it can shift, right? Mother tongue is not just the first language you learn. It is that, but what it especially is the language that is not Latin, right? Above all, sort of mother tongue as a vernacular is a relational term. It's a term that designates a language of a lower cultural status, and it almost always means a language that is generally not written, right? And a language that is not acquired through the same kind of mediation, right? And so when you hear this distinction, mother tongue versus Latin, you see this in Dante, but also in many other medieval texts. The mother tongue is oral. The mother tongue is learned at home. The mother tongue is not learned from books. The mother tongue is learned easily. The mother tongue is learned in the body. The mother tongue is learned with milk, right? Sort of that whole, scene of nutrition and assimilation that seems to be unmediated, right? And the artificial languages, Latin, right, are mediated. They're learned from books, they're learned in school. You also get the kind of maternal, paternal distinction that comes into play. And they're usually learned painfully with rules. Rule is a major category, but also suffering, right? The whip, instead of the nourishment of the mother tongue, you get the sort of pain or punishment, the discipline and rigor of, both the rule that is the rule of grammar, but also the sort of punishing figure of grammar that circulates in a lot of medieval texts. So why is this interesting? Because printing, other factors as well, but I think largely printing put these two categories of the natural and artificial language, the mother and father tongue, on a kind of collision course towards each other. And what happens between roughly 1529 and 1550, those are the years that I think are really the pivotal ones, is you have this emergence of what is effectively a historically new species of language, which is the artificial mother tongue, right? The natural artificial tongue, the vernacular that is also the language of grammar and the father and rule, right? And so that level of mediation and also pain and all of those, and rule and order, and also that higher cultural status, suddenly all of that is grafted onto the very language that supposedly was natural, nourishing, oral, the language of identification, right? So, it's a collision of technology and the body on the one hand, but it's also a kind of crazy grafting of different cultural categories onto each other that comes to make possible, this would be, the underlying, stakes of the book, modern national languages as cultural and ideological formations. So the book is in many ways my response to, say, Benedict Anderson and his thinking of how printing contributes to the formation of national languages through, the constitution of what he calls imagined communities. I don't take issue with any of that work. It's extremely important for me, but I think it's not the only thing that's happening in terms of how something like a national language, even if we can't quite talk about the nation or national language in the 16th century, it's kind of proto-national language. The groundwork is really laid by technology, and not just by technology, but by printers, right? Because a lot of these developments that are happening, and even the very thinking of language, vernacular language, as technological and technologizable, the tongue getting tripped there is part of what's at stake here, because we're talking about a kind of regulation of the tongue that's happening by way of the page and by way of the printer's tools, right? So printers are really driving the machine here, right? Master printers who are also, and I think it's important to note, even though it's something I didn't bring out to my own satisfaction in the book, the possessors of capital, right? Because this is also really a story about print capitalism and the kind of relationship between capital and language that also then has this whole political dimension with the French kingdom. So I just talked way longer than I meant to about all of that, but so let's take a look at some images, and especially for those who haven't had a chance to look at any of the book yet, which, in my mind is everyone, because it's such a weird thing, which tells us something about what books are and these kind of weird objects that they are, that it's kind of impossible to imagine anyone reading your own book, because it's this kind of strange alienated thing. I want to take a look at some things that will give us some common ground for discussion, some images and then some passages. And so just quickly, this image that's been now staring at you for some time and that you've hopefully had a chance to study is the sort of very noted scribe and translator Jean Miellot, who was at the Burgundian court in the mid-15th century. This is him at work in his study with this very interesting desk that is featured in multiple miniatures of Jean Miellot. So it seems to represent a desk that he actually had. It's an unusual object. I think of it as a kind of bespoke object, but it's nevertheless a desk that tells us a certain amount about what scribal culture and textual production looked like in the mid-15th century. And just a couple quick things to note here is the use of two hands, of course, to write manuscripts. But one thing that really strikes me here is the proliferation of tools and instruments and the elaborate nature of the desk here, I think we're made to understand, well, it's actually a very interesting question. Is he copying or translating here? You know, is the book above being held in place, is that the exemplar of a copy, or is that the original of a translation? Because this is the miniature that appears at the beginning of a translation, a vernacular translation. But what's striking is that it seems to me that this is also a scene where manuscript is kind of being pushed to its technological limit. And the reason that's interesting to me is because this comes from right around 1450. And we know that not so far from the Burgundian court, right around 1450 in Mainz, Gutenberg and his associates, right, that kind of question mark that still always hangs over the development of printing technology, you know, are about to begin printing or have just begun printing the first books using movable type, you know, that artificial means of writing as it's thought of, right? So again, that just sort of holding in mind that that word artificial is attached to both printing, especially in its early days, as a kind of artificial way of writing, or even an artificial hand for writing, kind of prosthetic hand for writing, and all of the other sort of techne of language, grammar, poetics, rhetoric, sort of all of that, that's, you know, not to mention typography, right, that's going to come into play. So they, you know, they all kind of would fall under the category of arts of writing and arts of language in that robust sense of the 16th century or 15th century. So here we have Jean Miellot with sort of an explosion of tools and multiple hands in his study, just at the moment that printing arrives on the scene, if we let ourselves think about it that way. And then here is one of the earliest pictorial representations of printing, the famous mark of Jos Bad, or Badius, as he's sometimes known, also printed in Latin, extremely prolific Parisian printer who was around for many decades and had a couple of different marks, but this is the most well-known. And one of the things that, at least the reading that I do of this pair of images in the book, one of the things that you can track is that many of the same tools and technologies that were present in the Miellot scene, right, in the scribal scene, are actually still present here in the print shop, right? We can kind of identify, for example, the little, you know, the open book stand holding the exemplar, the same, you know, kind of little pouches for holding the instruments. There's a better word for that, a technical term that I'm forgetting, right? But now we also have the introduction of new tools. And perhaps for me, what's most interesting and most significant about this pair of images, just if we go back for a second, is compositionally, right? In the miniature, Miellot's desk, right, this kind of large wooden apparatus, is right at the center, but Miellot is also there, right? And you can see we're kind of right in the introduction of this kind of perspectival rendering. That's also another new technology kind of lurking in this miniature. But Miellot, I mean, if you actually like plot it out and you see the cross in the window, sort of helpfully identifies for us what the center of the image is. And it's right on Miellot, right? It's on his head and his hands. His hands are actually like right at the center of this picture in a kind of geometrical sense. The center of this composition, of course, is the apparatus, right? It's the printing press. And, you know, one thing that's interesting to note here is that in sort of very early discourse around printing, the discourse being generated by the artisans, right, the printers themselves, what's the main feature of the press is not the press, it's the type, right? The movable type is really the key technology, right? The metal, the letters, the characters, right? Those are the things that are really insisted upon. But already now by, you know, this comes to us from the very early, you know, the first decade of the 16th century, the press seems to be the sort of metonymically, I mean, the way we still talk about it, right? Because printing technology is not reducible to the press. And in its early days, it's not even the prominent feature, right? And the press is not new. We know this, right? It's an adapted agricultural press. But here we see it taking center stage. And then around this apparatus, which is now the center, because it is now the press that does the writing, right? It is no longer the scribe who writes. It is the press who writes. We have a multiplication of human bodies, and we have 6 hands instead of 2. And they are now doing, each set of hands is now doing one of the tasks that had previously been allocated to the scribe, right? So the scribe with 2 hands was doing everything in this scene in which he was the center, and now the machine is the center. And we have hands that seem to be, we don't have fewer hands with printing, we have more hands. We have a multiplication of hands. I sometimes think of those like polymassed figures, like the famous nature at Fontainebleau, right, with all the breasts around. And I sometimes think of a printing press as sort of like that polymassed figure, except it doesn't have breasts all around, it has hands, right? Printing press grows hands, it multiplies hands, because it needs more hands to do the work in this new division of labor. And this image is also really remarkable, not only for the way that human bodies get multiplied and hands get multiplied, but also for the way they get fragmented, even compositionally, right? We don't see the entirety of any human body. The one we see the most of is the puller pulling the lever on the press, but even he is sort of pushed out, through the force of the pull of the lever, pushed out of the frame of the woodcut. And the only name we see here, and really the absent person who's center stage, designated here by Prelum Ascensianum, it's an allusion to Josbad of As, right? So it's his press, right? Prelum press. So it's the master printer, the owner of the capital, whose body is not present, but who is, virtually or symbolically inscribed on the machine that he owns. And yet his hands are the ones not doing any work, right? So I think there's a lot to tell us about printing and bodies, sort of what happens to bodies and what happens to writing in a, kind of symbolic and social way from this pair of images. Okay, I'm going to try and move really quickly now through the rest so that we can open up for discussion. This is a picture of me operating a letterpress, and the reason that I've shown you a picture of myself, which is a little goofy, and it's a screenshot from Facebook because that's the only version I have, is because I only came to think the role of printing, and I only came to be in a position, even though I was already a reader of Derrida and a reader of Kittler and a reader of McLuhan and a reader of Stiegler and every theorist of media and technology. I didn't come to understand the way that printing and the way that a certain sort of operation of techne were affecting language and, were sort of at work as forces in the history of the French language until I rolled up my sleeves a little bit. And I was just saying to Marie and Jenny, as we were in the pre-waiting room, the sort of green room of Zoom here, that, I had done my dissertation work largely on the basis of, I'd spent a lot of time at the Bayenne, but I was afraid to go into Salle Y, where the books on reserve were. It was very intimidating. And I worked mostly from facsimiles and then digital copies. I was working at, sort of in the period between 2006 and 2010 when I finished. And then at some point I realized that I had to go into archives and I had to start working with the books, and I had to really learn how a printing press is operated. right? And so I visited a lot of early modern presses. I got my hands on, as many books as I could in the US and in France. And it really radically changed my thinking about this period. And I think, to me, that my own process in doing that was really informative in terms of thinking what was happening to the language, right? My own encounter with these materials and technologies really, it offered something, right? That's not even a strong enough word, right? But it produced knowledge for me, right? Which to me really it's enormously provocative for asking, well, what is knowledge then, right? If that's how it was gained. But it really, I want to say that I had to, in my own body, sort of inhabit that techne in order to know it in a way that made the thinking of it possible. It's something that I still don't entirely understand. Would be really interested in discussing, because I don't think it's the only way to know, certainly, but it is the way that I came to know. I had wanted to talk to you a whole bunch about this book, Champfleury, but I think that we probably don't have time. I'm just going to hit one or two highlights. And the highlights here, this is a 1529 treatise on typography that also really sets out a path in a very self-conscious and deliberate and rhetorically powerful, but also in its own way kind of awkward and naive way. Naive, not in a pejorative sense. It really sets out a path for the development and construction of the French language as a technology, precisely, right? And so, sort of in the beginning, Thory, he realizes there's a problem, right? Except it wasn't a problem before, right? For Thory, there's a problem that seems to impose itself, a problem that seems to take shape, which is that the French language changes, right? And that it's lacking in rule, right? Oh, devoted lovers of good letters, would to God that some noble heart apply himself to setting down and ordering by rule our French language, right? Somehow in 1529, the absence of rule, règle, right, is his word, in the French language comes to be perceived as a problem, right? Comes to be perceived as a lack or a défaut, right? It's, and that défaut, right, or that lack or that fault has a technological solution, right? And that's the structure that's going to be set in place, right? And there's a desire to arrest the movement of language, right? And in that desire to arrest the movement of language, there is a thinking of language, and especially vernacular language, as natural, as having a natural life. And the role of the printer and typographer here is going to be to intervene in that natural life of language, and to intervene with his tools, intervene with his technologies, which is both going to mean typographical technology, right? It's going to be about the repeatable form of letters. It's also going to be about grammar, rhetoric, right? So Thory is thinking those things together, right? He's thinking those technologies of language as being of a piece, right? And then he sets out this future, this history, right? This history of the French language to come that will make French a great language like Greek and Latin. What does he do? He breaks it down into steps and parts. He turns that history itself into a kind of techne with iterable parts, right? So he turns the history, like, this is kind of humanist philological perspective on language. Okay, let's look at the history of Greek and Latin. Let's see what were the steps that allowed them to be produced as great language, right? And this is also the technical dimension, right? It's a question of production and a question of what human hands can do to language, right? That's that phusis techne distinction, right? It's not, the French language does not suffice on its own, right? It's natural life. It cannot bring itself into being. It needs hands, right? It needs human hands, right? So this passage, I would have reason to lament the sterility of our hands, but I hope that, God willing, some noble Christians, some Donatus, these are grammarians, right? Donatus, the first text printed by Gutenberg, or some French quintillion will quickly be born if he's not already edified. Super interesting to think about a human being or human body, a grammarian, as being edified or constructed, right? As if somehow the human is already being turned into a work of techne with this movement of language. So I implore you, let's all give each other courage. All things had a beginning. When one person treats letters, that's him, that's Tori in this very book, and in other words, a third will come to declare expressions, and then another still will arrive to order fine oration. In this way, we will find that little by little, we will make way so that we will come to the great poetic and rhetorical fields full of beautiful, good, and fragrant flowers of speaking and saying honestly and easily. Easy is always a word that, you know, goes straight to technology too. Honestly and easily, anything we might want. Right? So this kind of fantasy of language being easy, it's sort of part of that same fantasy of, oh my God, the printing press can produce in one day what it would take scribes, you know, 300 scribes a year to write. This kind of immediacy of language, this kind of humanist fantasy also of you know, good language, beautiful language, equal to antiquity, that could be possible now with our language in this historical unfolding that looks a lot like a technological process and begins in the printer's shop. So Tori is going to set out to show us how to make letters using our tools, the ruler and compass, the queen and king of instruments, as he calls them, which happen to form, as he shows us, the letter A. In the bottom right-hand corner, the bottom left is showing us the same letter A à l'envers. And he says this is specifically for printers to see what it looks like backwards, right? But the idea here is that thanks to the grid, the ruler and compass, and his detailed set of instructions that he's going to lay out in the third book, you can produce these letters precisely as he does, right? So also, you know, sort of doing with the hands what movable type is already doing, right? So this kind of bringing into the body that technology of printing. And he wants the same thing to happen with the tongue. I'm going to have to skip a little bit here because I just don't want us to take up the time, but just insisting that there's this sort of recognition of a historical process that has specific steps that can then be taken up and repeated in the modern context with the French language. And that what it produces is good knowledge in memory, right? So this memory, right, that is also, you know, this extremely important part of the technological scene as this kind of externalized form of memory that writing constitutes, that is also what French is seen to be lacking, right? And that grammar, the grammatical project is participating in that. Also, just to show you the quotes in the margins, this is the first text printed in the French language with quotation marks here in Tori. But what this means, right, this technology is always grafting itself onto nature. Since I already showed you a picture of myself, I will note that this branch of la science, the label isn't there, but the top one with the letters, I actually have tattooed on my back after I wrote this book, because in a way this is a, you know, it's an image about tattooing. It's an image about grafting. It's an image about that graft of language as techne and nature, but to an extent that they are no longer seen as rigorously distinct categories, right? Because for Tori, letters are already in some way, even though they are highly technical, right? We just saw those images of the ruler and compass and the grid, right? They're highly technical, mathematical. They involve instruments, ruler and compass, but they are also somehow participating in nature, emerging out of nature, perfecting nature, right? That there is some way in which artifice has to be brought in with our hands, right? As he talks about in that opening invocation to the reader, right? That exhortation. Our hands are needed. Language, our natural language, nature needs our hands. And yet somehow there is some way in which that graft will produce some new kind of life, right? And this is what really interests me the most, is the kind of artificial life that is being generated. And this becomes something, it is absolutely apparent in, for example, the Défense et illustration de la langue française, du Ballet, the famous manifesto in 1549. But there is this kind of supernatural, uncanny, super life and survival of language that is being invented here in this grafting of the natural and the artificial. You know, and just to give us one super interesting, clear instance of this, you know, if with our fecundity there were certain règle, right, the tool, it seems to me that upon correction, the language would be richer and more perfect. And one of the reasons this is such an interesting quote to me is not only because it speaks this need of the natural, you know, fecundity of the French language to be brought under the, you know, order and rule of techne, but it also speaks directly to the print shop, right? Because that word correction is a word that takes on an absolutely, you know, like, it can't be overstated how much this word belongs to the scene of printing, right? Of course it predates printing, but, you know, Anthony Grafton and others, I think, have demonstrated really well. You know, Anthony Grafton, his really interesting text, and I'm not sure to what extent it's known compared to some of his other work, Culture of Correction, shows us the extent to which, you know, the corrector, the figure of the corrector and practices of correction become important in entirely new ways with printing. And of course, Story himself worked for decades as a corrector in a printer's shop before writing this text, right? So when we hear correction, we're thinking of something, an intervention of printing into the life of the French language. And so I can be more or less done there. I'll show us just a couple of final images, including this wonderful lettered man, the homme lettré. The famous letters superimposed on bodies. You know, for Tori, the point of this is that letters already exist in a natural proportion to human bodies, right? So again, kind of dissolving of that hard boundary between nature and techne, or thinking of them as different and yet also operating in some kind of conjunction or articulation with each other. And then finally, we see in Tori that already this project of something like a national language that will, even as it looks to make the mother tongue technological, also looks to all the more forcefully identify it in a way that becomes ontological with a, you know, proto-national subject, right? And here we see him saying, it seems to me that under correction, right, sous correction, it would be nicer for a Frenchman to write in French than in another language, right? And keep in mind, those words are both François. Nicer for a Frenchman to write in French than in another language, as much for the certainty of his said language, it's weird in French too, as to decorate his, sorry for the typo, nation and enrich his domestic tongue, which is as beautiful and good as another when it is laid down well in writing. Right, so this absolutely historically new if we, sort of take starting from the, the 1,000 years predating Tohi's writing, an imperative suddenly, and even a moral imperative, and what seems to be some kind of identification on the level of nature itself, right? To write in the language that is your mother tongue, that becomes your language of writing. This was, because of the historical periods that we all work on, that this is not the case, right? Prior to this moment, there's no imperative in the 15th century for someone who lives in the French kingdom to write in French. Everyone's writing in Latin or another, it's just not, this identification with language is not there. And we see that this is happening, among other things, through the grid, right? And through printing. I'll just go back here, right? That whatever is happening in this superimposition of nature and technology is also allowing for an alignment of a subject and a national language, which in the case of the French language in this particular moment also happens to share the name of the king, Francois. And I could talk a lot more about this image, which is also on the cover of the book. We can maybe leave that.
But thank you for your amazing energy and responses and thoughtfulness and thinking with us. And I think, it's a lot of kind of distributed thinking and knowledge production happening here, which is really wonderful. And we really look forward to you joining us in future sessions too.
I would love to. This was a blast for me and really a privilege. Thank you so much.
So thank you everyone who's been able to join. Amazing if you've been able to stick to the end, and if you haven't and you're watching the recording, then thank you too. And we'll be in touch with news of events in 2022. Thank you so much. Bye.